My name is Sowmya Kumar. I'm a partner in the labor and employment practice at IndusLaw. I'm very happy today to moderate this panel where we have general counsels from really diverse industries, and we'll be talking about some points, issues, and thoughts around employment relationships in the context of data privacy. That's the topic of the second panel today. Allow me to introduce Preeti Balwani, who's the General Counsel of Hindustan Coca Cola, Shyaam Nagarajan, who is the Vice President Legal at Glance, and Vinita Varghese, who is Head of Legal at Urban Company, and our very own Vaibhav Bhardwaj, who's also a partner in the labor and employment practice at IndusLaw. So today, in this panel, which is like I said, titled "Employment Relationships and Data Privacy," we thought we'd focus on a few areas that might be of interest to all of you, because data privacy is so large and it has so many facets. This panel will be focusing on employment relationships, other relationships. This is specifically in the context of Urban Company, which has a lot of platform partners and gig workers, and some specific challenges or issues that might concern them in a platform economy context, and how they would impact data privacy, or what are some of the questions that can come up in this in this regard. So we thought we'd speak about 4 or 5 broad issues, starting from hiring practices. It's pretty ironic that though the pandemic has given a drastic blow to our economy and we're still catching up, hiring has significantly increased in a lot of sectors. Especially there's a lot of, at least in the tech sector, we keep reading about how there is the talent has increased and how people are really scouting for tech talent in the country. So we thought we'd start this panel by talking a little bit about how hiring practices have changed over the times. After that, we will talk a little bit about practices, compliances, and how data protection laws are actually implemented in the context of various industries, and each of these industries that we will be talking about here. So this will sort of outline the general legal principles and how they would play out when it comes to actual compliances, some best practices, and the consent doctrine that we keep talking about, especially in the data privacy context. After that, we would move to the elephant in the room, which is the pandemic and how various industries have adapted to remote working, and what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the issues that come up specific to remote working. And then we would close with investigations. This is an area that is interesting and still evolving, at least in my view. So it'd be good to talk about how we can conduct investigations, especially in a remote working context. And then in the end, we'll take audience questions. I hope we can keep the questions to the end, and we'll take it up right at the end. So after what I hope was a short introduction, I think we will start speaking to the panelists, and we'd start talking about hiring practices. So Preeti, why don't we start with you? So since you've been part of Hindustan Coca Cola, which has a large, rich history and a lot of legacy in this country and globally. So why don't you can tell us about how you think, in your view, hiring practices have changed, and what are some of the challenges that have come up in the recent past to kind of grapple with some of these changes, especially from a technology standpoint.
Thanks, Soumya, and it's really nice to be here. And yes, Hindustan Coca Cola Beverages will complete 25 years of being incorporated in India. So it is a momentous period in time for us, and I think an important time in our history, because we have come to critical mass, and the pandemic did make some of those needs, or technology needs, expedited some of those needs and accelerated some of those requirements. But if I were to think about trends or changes in trends, I would say that India is perhaps was and is one of the largest exporters of services and people, and because we are sort of human capital, and that's one of our biggest areas of export as well. This industry has seen some amount of unorganized and then getting into organized, and I think technology has played some amount of skill there. For us, hiring practices pre-pandemic were a combination of traditional, wherein we would perhaps use social media or professional connection platforms to have source CVs, have traditional search firms or search partners to help us create a database or to have particular searches. And I don't think all of that has changed. But what has changed is perhaps the intermediate steps. We have used technology to, say, for instance, filter resumes. Use technology to also try to create interview guides for ourselves and feedback forms, and of course have actually shifted to virtual interviews. And I don't think that we really imagined what that would mean for us. And I think one of those things that perhaps has been something that a large organization such as us grapples with is also phishing attacks and attacks where people are claiming to provide jobs and interviews on behalf of the Coca-Cola company, which is not the case. And it has been, at least what we've noticed is there's been an increase in that trend in the last 2 years. It existed even prior to the pandemic, but we feel that there has been a more velocity to that. And those are some of the trends that we are noticing. Of course, we're a large sort of human capital organization. We have 7,000 plus employees, and it's not always that the employees that we recruit have the ability to sit for an interview in front of a computer screen. And sometimes there is a challenge to ensure we give the best employee and employer experience to the candidate. And that's very important for us. In terms of what we've done to solve some of these, it's a bit of a trial and error, and I think we've agile and pivoted as we've gone along.
Sure. I think what I know this is also reported, but I think, Vinita, this is probably a good way to kind of loop you in now. You spoke about the digital divide generally, right? That's one of the catchphrases that we see in the context of today. So how everybody has not been able to adapt to a completely digital world, especially people from a different socioeconomic background. There's so many challenges in such a vast country such as ours. So Vinita, I know that these are not your employees, and these are your platform partners who provide various services via the platform. So maybe I think you could also take off from what Preeti said from that context, and then say, how do you think this the hiring or the onboarding has changed for the platform partners in the current circumstances? Has it changed? If so, how has that kind of panned out for you?
Sure. Thank you, Sowmya. Thank you for having me here. And I think one thing I would agree with Preeti on, that a lot of it remains trial and error. We are learning on the job as we proceed with this. To give you a bit more context on how one would look at engaging individuals outside of the employment traditional relationship.
Right.
Because given the socioeconomic sector, given the upward mobility of these individuals, they're not as tech savvy as one would like. And it starts with a simple thing of having the right device to be able to get onboarded or engaged online. And in that process, one would look at, as one would as an employer and an employee, one looks at collecting documents. And that data needs to come in. Now, what documents do we collect? How do we go about informing them why they must provide some information? And a small, very, daily problem one would see is, even if they get comfortable with, let's say, using WhatsApp or some other platform, the images would be blurred, right? So we're looking at collecting data offline from people who are not comfortable, not familiar, and are learning to do this because their current livelihood has now become dependent on being able to function on an app, on a tech platform. So we would, and also the human, I think, element in engaging individuals who are not as supremely professionally skilled. It's not a CA firm hiring a CA. It's
Right.
a bunch of non-beauticians, lawyers, etc., hiring beauticians and carpenters. The ability to communicate with them in person and explain these things to them went out the window when the pandemic
Right.
hit. Even to a degree of training them, telling them what the platform was, how the app works, to teach them this entire process online was quite a challenge, and a challenge more for the audience than for the company, because
Right.
being a tech company is something that we are quite comfortable with. But getting them onboarded for something which we think and we strongly believe is a great platform or a great future for these skill sets.
Right.
But for them to get onto this page and start giving us documentation, for instance, if one were to do a background check, which is something that we do as a platform to ensure these are home services, so it's a bit tricky. There's a safety element involved. To explain to them how this will happen. The idea that police verification can't be done because in the pandemic time, the cop can't go to your house if you're in a red zone. So from data collection to implementation to use to dissemination, we had to overhaul that system. And I think it's what the one advantage that's come out of the whole process is now this group of people is also savvy with their phones,
Right.
their apps. There's been a forced but a brilliant layer of education that has come in because of the dependency that came about. And of course, the challenges there are for us to manage this communication, this tech, this data in a new way. As opposed to collecting photocopies, now we're getting blurred pictures. And we're like, no, take another picture, please.
Yes.
They learn to how to hold their camera over their license carefully, right?
Yeah.
So that has been a diametric shift from how we used to even attract talent. Like Preeti mentioned, right? They would attract talent through social media. Now they have skills. How do you expect this skill set to be attracted via LinkedIn? So all those measures have seen a drastic change.
Right. Right. I think we'll touch upon this when we talk a little bit more about the best practices and how we can actually distill the broad principles that law mandates in terms of consent, storage, transfer, how that can actually translate in a meaningful way to each of the data principles or the people we collect data from. So I think that is going to become a lot more crucial going forward, I think. So I will maybe touch upon this a little more in the next one. Shyaam, let's quickly have your inputs here. I know the tech front and the kind of business that you do is pretty much new, exciting, and upcoming, and big tech, small tech, and the various techs that are going on in terms of generation. So maybe you can tell us for you in the kind of space you're in, what has changed in terms of hiring? Is there any increased scrutiny on data protection? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Soumya, and great to be here. In fact, very interestingly, we were talking about this a few weeks back with the HR about how post-COVID, post 2020 March, the entire system just changed, right? Like we had a system, and again, like I work in Glance, again, like a startup which like formed in 2019. So we have this very I know it sometimes sounds harsh to say indisciplined, but we have a very indisciplined way of functioning sometimes, where the candidates come in and the HR ushers them into a conference room, and this is pre-COVID, and you speak to them, and there's one interviewer panel that happens, and the second one comes in, and then there's an HR round and all that, and then probably takes about 3-4 hours, and then you give your feedback, you do a debrief, and it's done. Like you decide whether you want to go ahead. Come the post-COVID 2020, we've everything has moved online. So HR is extremely happy about it for one reason, that there is data which is getting there's feedback which is coming onto the system. Nothing is happening offline.
Right.
You know that there is a candidate and there are 3 people who are interviewed, so you have some feedback. And there are, of course, like the platforms that even I think Preeti was also mentioning. There are a lot of these platforms, and like we also use Darwin Box and we also use Greenhouse and all that. So lot of these platforms have really evolved, and as I also agree that there's a lot of evolution that's still happening today. So one is the fact that there is some amount of data that gets into some of these platforms. It's easier for teams to figure out. It's easier for even candidates to figure out. We also deal with a lot of people in the tech field. So for them, getting onto a Zoom interview is not very difficult. The flip side, and I'll try and cover this very quickly, is that we also had a few instances where people started contacting the interviewers directly because the email IDs were being shared with the calendar invites. So we had to, at some point in time, and we started hearing this from various parts saying that, hey, we are like, I interviewed 10 people today, and 5 people have started asking me on email. Like they've started email me saying, where did I go wrong? Can we connect on LinkedIn and things like that. So you really can't feel bad about it, but yes, there is certain amount of data that is going out, and you feel that, hey, this wouldn't have happened pre-COVID because your email ID, though sometimes it's easy to guess, it doesn't get easily shared. So we've also tried to figure some ways to mask some of these things to ensure that not a lot of information goes out, and only that needs to even come in. Like at an interview stage, you also don't need a lot of information from the candidate, at least on record. You probably need the CV, you probably need a little bit of information to go out, but let's not try and create a data mine at our end unnecessarily and at their end. So that's how things have changed, and it's evolving. And I feel that this is a space. If this kind of a pandemic continues, there will be more tech evolutions that will happen to see how, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere, but I mean, this is how we've gone about some of these things.
Great. So I think from what I understand or what I gather from what you're saying is that the intermediary space in the recruitment industry is getting a lot stronger, a lot more sophisticated, and there's a lot that one can do in that space, because given how direct connects can be challenging in how we are functioning. So the intermediaries seem to be getting a lot more weightage or a lot more savvy generally. So maybe Vaibhav, you can tell us from a legal or a contractual standpoint. So if a company like either Urban Company or Glance or HCCB is going to engage some of these recruitment intermediaries, so as to speak, so is there something that they need to ensure is there from a data protection standpoint in contracts, for instance? So maybe do you want to say something about that? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Soumya. So just to give some perspective on clauses, terms and conditions, which ideally should form part of a document, considering we are looking at background checks, and these background checks are usually undertaken at times also, even prior to the person joining the organization. And at the time of recruitment, it is very common for employers to conduct these kind of background verification checks, and it's simply to undertake and to verify the educational records, past work experience. Therefore, a lot of information that is collected by employers at the time of joining is in furtherance to these background checks, and more or less they usually qualify as sensitive personal data within the meaning of the existing regime, which is the SPDI rules. Sensitive personal data refers to critical information, medical history, sexual orientation as well. So therefore, under the existing law, there is a strict requirement to take a prior consent before even collecting, processing, or transferring or disclosing anyone's sensitive personal data or information. Therefore, in order to align with the law, it's always recommended to have a robust clause or a provision or a paragraph. You could either have it as part of your contracts or even as part of your policies. And with respect to the employees who have not still joined, you may have kind of any written documentation. It could be by way of an email itself, wherein there is a specific consent which is obtained from the person providing the data. And this is something which is required in law. The clause must mention the fact that the data is being collected, the purpose of such a collection, the entities to whom the data will be transferred, because in a background verification, I would say majority of the organizations usually outsource background verification to third parties, and also the kind of data that is being collected currently and will be collected in future. So all in all, care should be taken that how the clause is drafted, whether it satisfies all requirement of law, and as a And you may also be a little more considerate and be a little more careful. And you may also basically just put in a disclaimer by saying that while adequate measures for protecting data have been implemented, but no digitized data is completely secure. So as kind of a disclaimer. So this is basically how the clauses and how the policies and contracts should basically primarily consider.
So the one central theme from what you said, Vaibhav, is that consent is key, right? So whatever at the time, various points at the time of collection, processing, transfer, you take consent
Yes.
from the person you're collecting the data from, whether they are at an interviewee stage, even before they are onboarded into your organization. So I think today we're at a juncture where finally our Joint Parliamentary Committee has come up with its comment. We already have a bill in place, which has been in the while, taken a while for it to even come to this stage. So maybe you can take us through a little bit about what to expect from the bill and vis-a-vis what has changed basically from under the bill vis-a-vis the current legislation, because I think we are all operating at a sense that compliance is going to be a lot more onerous or a lot more multifaceted.
Sure.
Let's not even say onerous, maybe a lot more multifaceted going forward. So we need to know where we stand now and what we can expect under the bill. So maybe you can briefly give a sense of what is there currently and what we can expect under the bill.
Sure. If you look at as regards the legal framework is concerned, both the existing law, the SPDI rules, and the new bill basically provide for strict consent requirements for the collection, processing, and transfer of personal data, especially sensitive personal data.
Okay.
Before collecting sensitive personal data, the employer is required to obtain a proper consent from the employee, informing the employee that she or he has the option to not provide such consent or withdraw consent already given. The employer must also provide access to the personal data collected such that the same can be reviewed, modified, updated by the employee. Now, if you look at the new law, which is the Data Protection Bill of 2021, it also specifically provides a right to erasure to an employee, wherein the employee can even compel the entity that processed her or his personal data to erase such personal data when it is no longer required. The Data Protection Bill, while explicitly not changing the position of law, it brings in a significant amount of clarity regarding the consent requirements for collection and processing of data.
Okay.
The bill states that under certain circumstances, personal data which does not qualify as sensitive personal data may be processed without obtaining the consent of the person. So there's the flexibility which is being given under the bill that under certain conditions a consent would not be collected, and if it's a personal data and if it is collected in the context of employment, then a consent is not necessary and the employer can go ahead and can obtain this data from the prospective employee to be processed with regard to recruitment.
Okay.
The provision hence caters. Sorry, Sowmya, you were saying something?
No. I said no. I wasn't.
The provision hence caters to a situation wherein obtaining of consent for processing personal data would not be appropriate given the relationship of employment between the employer and employee. However, now the position in case of sensitive personal data remains the same, wherein you require a consent. Therefore, once the Data Protection Bill comes into force, one would be required to analyze, and by one I meant the employers would be required to analyze that the information. By looking at the information, they can determine whether it's a personal data or a sensitive personal data, and if it's a personal data, then there's a high possibility that a specific consent may not be required. And also, the Data Protection Bill is also stringent on the aspect that it even requires the third-party data fiduciary, that is the recipient of the data, to even notify the data principal, in our case being the prospective employee. So now in a background verification, as I said, that typically it's usually outsourced. Then the third party who is being appointed for background verification, once they receive the information of an individual, they would also be required to notify the individual that, hey, we have received your information. So this is something and I know for a fact that organizations are not too comfortable sharing the names and details of the third party who is conducting a background verification. Now, also, there is a very interesting concept which has been introduced under the new bill, which is the concept of right to be forgotten. Right. Organizations should ideally delete the data when it is no longer required, or when the purpose for which it was obtained has been already fulfilled. Okay. It should not be duly retained for a period longer than it is required, and the new bill addresses this issue. As per the bill, a person who basis of such disclosure was made and it has been withdrawn and was made contrary to the provision of the bill or any other law. Given that processing is a larger umbrella and it also covers storage of the information, now the practical difficulty of this is that there is certain set of information which we obtain from the employee, but we are required, or it's always advisable to retain it for a longer period than it is required. Just to give you an example, that since as part of background verification, you may collect 10 different information. Sure. Once the background verification result is out, you may the purpose has been solved, right? You may not retain the information, but that is not something which is advisable, because you never know if it's a negative background verification 3 months, 6 months down the line, there could be certain potential claims by the employee, and wherein you would require this kind of information to defend yourself and to rightfully basically submit as part of evidence. So that's why there's an interplay which is required. Sure. And the possibility of retaining data for a longer period than it is required is somewhat covered under the SPDI rules, because it states that an employer cannot retain any sensitive personal data for a period longer than it is required for the purpose for which the information was lawfully be used. So therefore, some flexibility is provided under the SPDI rules, since it says that data can be retained for a longer period, but with consent. So that's why, as part of your contracts policies, you may have provisions which clearly say that we may retain the data for a longer period of time in order to safeguard our interest, or some tactfully wording should be incorporated in your policies if you intend to keep the data for a longer period of time.
Okay, thanks, Vaibhav. I think that was a pretty good summary of what is there and then what we can expect under the bill. One thing I think which we've been reading up in all the discussions to the bill is that this is a rights-based framework, right? The entire the law and the discussion surrounding it seems from a rights-based framework. So Vinita, maybe we can take you in here and say that, okay, we're talking about the rights of the individual who's giving the data and safeguarding his or her rights. What does that mean for an organization or as an employer? How can that be distilled or kind of looked from a compliance standpoint? So if you're the employer and you're focusing on this, how would it work from that standpoint?
Thank you. Thank you, Vaibhav, for the summary. I think, Sowmya, the one thing which is changing while countries like India are evolving their data regime is that the focus has changed to ownership of data. Who owns the data? Now the regime is built around the data subject, as opposed to the entity's information or processing information. That viewpoint has changed. And given the fact that the viewpoint has changed, the way we look at data as employers, as organizations, that also needs to take that turn to look at it as something that is not owned by the company, but by somebody else. And therefore, they continue to have continuous rights on those data points. Now, within that framework and within the consent topics that Vaibhav touched on, there are aspects on when and how an employer would provide the subject, the individual, with the ability to give consent. Right? As an employer, how do I build this? Do I put in an explicit consent? If I have an app, must I have an unchecked box for consent? Or can I have a check box? Do I just make a reference to the applicable terms for data collection? Or do I call out every point everywhere? practically, reasonably, for this to occur, the organization needs to understand what data is being collected and to what end. That process needs to run independently as a focus area of employers and of companies.
Sure.
That data we must be treated separately from our business processes because the impact now is much wider.
So maybe if we have to start here, and Vaibhav also mentioned companies should have policies and clauses in their contracts. Would Preeti or Shyaam, any of you who has views on this, would you recommend having, say, an elaborate clause in every employment contract, or asking employees to sign something in addition to their employment contract and say, these are the requirements and this is what we're doing, this is the data we're taking, this is what you have to do? Is that something you would recommend from either of your organization's standpoint? Preeti, maybe?
So I wanted to comment first on what Vaibhav touched upon a little while ago on the use of the intermediary and collection of data. The relationship between us as a organization, we ensure that we have sufficient disclaimers, end-use restrictions, and consent requirements in all of our contracts with service providers as well.
Sure.
Further, the service provider is collecting data for a potential employee, but there is no sort of relationship of employer and employee established at the time.
Right.
And therefore, we have specific clauses in our contracts with our vendors to ensure that they have the checks and balances in place. And that is something that we find is becoming increasingly necessary or critical. When it comes to, in general, the philosophy that we follow is one of express consent. There is always a requirement for us to clarify the end use, the relevance, the period, and the purpose for which the data is being collected and stored, the manner of storage of the information, to ensure and give comfort that the systems are not vulnerable, and that we have robust systems for storage of information as well. And then express consent for use. These tend to be widely worded. And not just from an employee context, we also have a bit like urban company distributors who we have transitioned to an application, and therefore we do collect data or what personal data, and therefore require such express consents. And I think the rule of thumb has always been, even before sort of the advent of the bill, our philosophy was that data privacy is very much a fundamental right of a citizen, and therefore we do follow very, very high standards. To your specific point about contracts, there is, yes, we include data privacy consent clauses in all contracts, and it is critical to ensure that there are these clauses, and I think we've transitioned to including these clauses perhaps maybe 2 years ago, and this is not for us. What is going to be a challenge, Sowmya, and I have to admit, is that we have employees who've been on roles with us for 10 years and 15 years, right? And what do you do with those legacy contracts, right? You can fix the problem now, going forwards prospectively. But what is it that we can do or will do retrospectively? And I think we have some ideas for those. One of those is to ensure that there's a proper policy in place, because all of our contracts ensure that policies are included in employment contracts as well, are deemed included. And therefore, that's one of the ways in which we are working to ensure that there is appropriate level of clarity. However, that doesn't solve the problem of express consent, right? It's just a one-way unilateral disclosure. And in order to get that express consent, it requires a pen and paper signature of about the 8,000 employees that we have. And we haven't yet found a way to digitize that. But yes, that's where we are at.
Another thing about data, I think, is that we can't look at it in silos, right? So the idea of jurisdiction is becoming a lot more crucial in a data protection context. Shyaam, maybe do you want to talk about kind of global compliances, since data is the data that we collect from an employee here can be stored in a server in somewhere else, and if it is Europe, there are other issues that could crop up in terms of GDPR or any other legislation. So do you want to say talk a little bit about how compliances also have to be viewed in that sense globally?
Yeah. In fact, I just also wanted to touch, which relates to some of these points that I think Preeti and Vinita were also talking about, is that I think policy is key in some of these things, and even in terms of compliance, right? Like, I mean, the world, I think, has been different post 2018 from a GDPR perspective. Ever since GDPR came in, May 25th was like a paradigm shift, at least for us. And when I say us, more from an InMobi group perspective, because Glance is still a India-focused company, but InMobi is like has its operations elsewhere. So one of the first things that we also grappled at that point in time, and we'd started the preparation much before that, but we also grappled is we figured out that there are some employees, and this is not talking about we gave a lot of focus on how do we treat our partners and customers, and what do we do in relation to data processing addendums, and what are the basic what are the changes that you need to make to the privacy policy. But it took us a while to figure out that we have a bunch of folks, we have a bunch of employees in Europe, in UK at that point in time, and we had to ensure that their data in the system had to be preserved, like in the sense that there are certain things that had to be kept separate, and that you had to definitely ask consent and ensure that some of those things, the consent-based mechanism had to be built in there. And over the years, and I know 2018 is not that far behind, but what we've also done is that it's because of GDPR, and again, very shortly, we got CCPA also, which is the California consumer protection, the privacy law that came.
Right.
The world is changing. So it's not that today you're going to have a PDP. It's probably going to come in 2022 or 2023. You also have a law coming up, or a law already there in Brazil. There's something coming up in China. There's something upcoming in Vietnam. And today the companies also have a global outlook. So it's not just, and to Preeti's point, that policy is key, right? Like in the sense that today you can keep changing, or you can have, yes, there will be that grappling issue of how do you get clear and express consent. But unless you have a policy, and I feel that some of those things will flow better, like when you have a policy or you have some kind of a guidelines, which are best practices, which are global practices. So you don't need to say that, hey, in India, I'm going to do this, but in China, I'm going to keep this separate, or in UK, I'm going to do this. So it is going to take a while, because of course, like people in UK or people in I say privacy nuanced or privacy evolved jurisdictions like US and Europe might understand some of these things better. People in probably Asia and Southeast Asia don't understand this. Absolutely. But I think people are also changing. Like companies are changing the way they look at things. Like even employees look at it differently. They're saying that, hey, why don't we have something which is available to say a US data subject, or why isn't the entire concept of the entire data subject request that came with GDPR, and which is there in CCPA, and which is also there in the PDP bill. Those are things that are really, really key. So I feel that it's very important that companies keep, and this is one word which is again very close to the tech industry as such. I don't know how many of them implement us. We also kind of struggle with it, is the privacy first framework, to say that privacy by design. So you build your infrastructure, you build your technology with privacy first as the approach, right? So it's easier said than done, because you can say this and like you can leave it to the engineers, you can leave it to the product guys, you can leave it to the privacy guys. But to come up with something to say that, hey, I'm going to build something, I'm going to ensure that there is going to be a particular mechanism to it, and there is going to be a particular protection of some rights. And I think this entire thing talks about how you protect, and which is what Vinita was also saying, that today the world is looking at who owns the data subject owns the data. There is no, I think, ambiguity regarding that. So as long as you keep that as the focus, then the rest of it falls in place. And of course, I feel that it's only through a lot of internal mechanism, safeguards, through policies, through a lot of awareness modules that you can spread some of these things and ensure that everyone feels protected and ensure that the data is protected.
I also think that the data has to be, while we say privacy by design, I think there are a lot of competing considerations that come up, and we actually need to weigh several factors in a situation. The most common example is COVID and the whole vaccination data, right? Because on one hand, there is litigation before the Supreme Court saying we don't have the law, nobody is mandated to provide vaccination data, but there is public health. There are lots of circulars which say only if you're vaccinated you can work, come to office, and things like that. So I think it's also good to examine that this has to be viewed in, there could be other concerns in a larger context also that impact. Preeti, so I think we'll again come back to you because of the sector in which you're in, and it's the manufacturing sector. You have like offices across all states, and you must have had a tough time trying to figure out which circular is issued by which local authority and where vaccination data must be collected and how it should be collected, and in this larger situation that we are in. So maybe do you want to throw some light about that?
So Sowmya, a couple of things, and one, I think Shyaam made an important point about the local law, which talks about data localization, and I think we need to also keep that as an Indian organization at the back of our mind, that and that also interplays in the decisions we make, right? So we're very much conscious of ensuring data localization. To the previous point, to your current point, I'll answer this question in two parts. In the first wave, we were concerned about business continuity. So where can we manufacture, where and how can we transport, and where and how can we sell. And we had a sort of visual representation, like a traffic light, of the 792 districts in this country, and we weren't aware of the fact that there were 792 districts in this country. But that was the learning curve, right? In the second wave, we were focused on oxygen, and how do we procure oxygen that is A, required for our manufacturing facilities, and B, required by the government because of the acute shortage. And C, to your specific question on vaccine collection data, and frankly, we follow the same system, right? So we have a system in which we track and map per state and per district what are the relevant legislations, and we do it like a bit of a traffic light. So we have a red, amber, green sort of system in terms of how we map and manage some of these things. And one of the things we found that helps us is and helps business and HR is to have like a sort of map of India with a traffic light of which state is red, which state is amber, which state is green, and we run that in the peaks of the waves. We run it on an everyday basis, but we otherwise run that as a legal team, providing information on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis, depending on the severity, and that's how we do it. But when it comes specifically to compliance with law, of course, we make sure that we're fully compliant with all government orders and notifications. But at this point in time, we haven't sort of made any specific call outs to our employees regarding the fact that you cannot come to work if you're not vaccinated.
Sure.
And we have a very high vaccination rate with double vaccination in our organizations. With close to 99% of our population is fully double vaccinated, and I think it's been completely voluntary. We've created camps and places to facilitate vaccination for our employees.
Sure.
And we try to make sure that we are compliant and ensure that there is no compromise on those government orders or notifications. But at this point in time, we haven't restricted any access or entry, and I don't think we will either.
Vinita, I think this issue is also very, very relevant for your business, right? While they could be like what Preeti said from an internal employee standpoint, but you also have a large number of partners who they may not necessarily be able to work remotely. So that question is moot there. So in this situation, is there something that you have been doing in terms of collection, telling them, or maybe addressing, what is becoming vaccine hesitancy and things like that? At the same time, getting to know their status. Is there something that you are doing for all your partners, for instance, on your?
Sure. So, Sowmya, what we did and exactly what Preeti mentioned, I think most organizations have taken that approach of facilitating vaccination, of encouraging people to go and be safe at home or in office. What we did was we extended this exact practice set to the entire partner base as well, and similarly tracked red zones, states which were in trouble, critically were in trouble, because the business continuity for us is including the fact that they are able to earn their livelihood through the platform.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Right, because it not just affects the company, it affects the entire partner base who potentially may be looking at a weekly earning to make sure their lives are on track. So we did the entire mapping by quite similarly for the partner base as well, and allowed them to come in. Of course, it's an expensive process for them. So we took on the cost burden, we procured medication, partnered with the right people in the market, and encouraged them to go ahead. Again, brilliant, I think people are very smart and very careful and very conscious of their families and their health. So a large amount of the base employees and partners have taken up the opportunity to go ahead and do this.
Sure.
At the second leg, where they now are home service providers, right? This is a full stack model, fulfillment-based business, and they need to go into people's homes. Within that service sector, some of this became even more essential in the pandemic, especially if you're working, the fact that your geyser is broken down and need someone to come and do this for you. At the same time, how do you keep safety in mind? Because the dependency on this workforce almost doubled, but they also were the most at risk.
Yes, frontline workers, so as to speak. Yes.
And the customers, in fact, mutual, right, between professionals and customers, there is a certain degree of risk and a certain degree of ownership that we started seeing and requesting. So we requested and asked whether they would be willing to give self-declarations on their temperature, on their health, if they're willing to share their vaccination status, to allow the customer to see it. And if the customer was willing to say that, yes, I am symptom-free, please come in and help me run my house. Now, this data, as Vaibhav mentioned, is SPDI, right? So it has to be very carefully collected if it is being shared voluntarily, and it has to be encrypted, mapped, access controls to be put in place.
Right.
For a data set like this. And those access controls are, not difficult, but can be onerous because of the sheer volumes.
Right, absolutely.
And the audience. So a professional would simply hand over a medical certificate or a vaccine certificate without realizing that it's probably sensitive to him and or her, and they shouldn't, or they are not required to share it this easily. So there is a lot of education that's gone on, but that data set where voluntarily given has to be treated in the red, amber, green category as a red high risk data set.
Right.
And a lot like, I'm sure, a couple of years back, all of us have seen the Aadhaar regime came in and what it was meant to do with Aadhaar collection, the vault, etc. Very robust systems need to be put in place for this as well. And that involves from collection, when they collect it, that it flows through the app platform into a safe access controlled area, as opposed to being scattered between every city and every city manager. So I think that's how the data set was treated.
I think from what you and Preeti have said, so it seems like even if there is this broad framework of a law that we have, so I think it has to be supplemented by a lot of policy and a lot of internal work that each organization has to do. So basically distill the law and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do to ensure complete compliance. I think we need to start viewing both simultaneously, because I think now there's a lot of talk on, say, a remote working law that is supposed to come in and we don't really know what that law is going to contain and how, whether it would have, any concerns even from a data privacy standpoint, because there's a lot of talk about confidential data being kind of hampered because of the pandemic, and whether this remote working law is going to cover both personal and non-personal data in that sense, apart from general concerns of flexible working and employee welfare and all of that. So I think another kind of point that we can probably talk about now is investigations, right? So they may not, I don't know if this remote working law is actually going to talk about how some company compliances or processes are going to be, how they can actually work in a remote way. I think my guess is that it may not. It may provide a broad-based kind of framework and then require companies to kind of have internal policies and to kind of work within the broad framework of the law. Something like the POSH Act, which provides a framework, and then kind of build it into that. So I think, Shyaam, I would like to hear you on this, right? So since tech, again, like I said, you all are probably used to working remotely. Maybe not to this extent, but in a fashion. And since you have global teams across the world, do you think that now with this, where remote working is going to be a lot more consistent, or it's more of a long-term thing, do you think there's something you need to put in place for, say, conducting investigations, misconduct? Because in a severance context, it's always going to be important if letting go of an employee, if there's some dispute or anything. So how do you think you would want to look at this from an internal standpoint?
A very interesting point, Soumya. In fact, I wanted to say that this probably not really related to the employee side of things, but the group company had a tryst with the Federal Trade Commission in the US a few years back, and ever since that we need to do investigations, in the sense we need to ensure that there is a third party audit that happens every 2 years or every 18 months. And that needs to be submitted. So ever since that happened in 2016, we've been ensuring that those audits happen. And some of these audits or some of these assessments or investigations, as it may be called, have been done online, at least 90% of it, because it is being done by, say, foreign bodies, or it's being done by foreign agencies. And I see that there is a lot of learning that we can do from some of these things, especially in and as you rightly said, there's a lot. I think the last 2 years itself, even POSH has taken it to a different level, because the kind of investigations that happen, and the kind of policies that come in saying that what is it that you can do when you are remotely working from home, right? Even when your video is on, there are certain things that you need to be cognizant about, that you need to be aware of. Yeah. So it's very important that some of these things are actually etched down in terms of policies, and etched down in terms of guidelines for the employees, saying that these are things that can, while you are working from home or you're working remotely, it doesn't mean that you have a free hand in a lot of these things. Yes, a lot of companies, including ours, have a very employee-first approach. So saying that we give a lot of freedom, and freedom comes with responsibility. So, but it's very important that there is some amount of the employee knows that, okay, there is a line that you need to draw, or the company also knows that there is some kind of a boundary that you need to have to ensure that some of these things are not some of these things don't go rogue. So I always believe that it's probably a guideline or a policy which kind of paves way for some of these things, and how you can and it's difficult, in the sense that in today's world you really can't say how some of these things can go. For example, even firing an employee because that employee has done a misconduct. Thankfully or fortunately, we've not had that instance now. But I know that there can be instances where you will be on the discovery mode when something like this happens. Right. You need to figure out, it's easier to probably do this in the offline mode when you are in office, because you can call the person into a meeting room, you can speak to them. But when you're trying to do this, in fact, I know something very, very not related to this, but we had a tough time trying to find an employee, because the employee simply refused to log in at some point in time. And the employee had the office laptop, the employee had the phones, But for a few weeks, we realized that this employee was just playing truant,
Right.
and we couldn't do much. So yes, there were disciplinary actions that were taken, but there are some restrictions, and you sometimes get onto that only when you start grappling some of these things. So
Right.
it's always good to maybe come up with some of these situations and ensure that you can probably put some of them into writing.
True, because some of the questions that people that keep coming up is that now I think Amazon is a little infamous for this, but there's a lot of surveillance that they seem to be doing. People are installing software, people are doing remote audits just to see if some personal, could be a mix of personal and company data that's being transferred. And some people, it's the pandemic, so people may not be able to give company laptops. People work on their own systems which has their own data, and the bulk of the company's business is kind of done out of there. So those challenges are there. If there's an investigation, whether you can take hold of that laptop, for instance, to do a forensic audit, how that works, because people just stall it, like you rightly said. People may just say I'm unwell, or they may not be able to. The cooperation gauging that becomes a lot tougher in a remote sense. So Preeti, since you're at the forefront, you might have done a lot of these investigations. Do you want to say how you all look at it, maybe even globally, and from an India standpoint, whether the way in which we handle these is going to change, and how?
Well, Soumya, this is an interesting question, and sort of an interesting point in time regarding this question, because of the challenges that we faced, and I think one of the things that we have to always remember is that we are in a particular jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction has some guidelines regarding investigations, and I think that always will remain paramount for us in terms of ensuring compliance. Right. So whether it's a investigation regarding a misconduct under the standing orders, or whether it is an investigation regarding a breach of our internal code of business conduct, etc., we need to ensure that we're number one, compliant with local law, and that investigations that are conducted adhere to the principles of natural justice, and the process that we follow is robust. In addition to that, I think we have a central code of business conduct which we follow as our guiding document across all Coca-Cola companies, affiliates, and subsidiaries. And if there is a particular, and we also sort of work across jurisdictions, so we make sure that we comply with the US Sarbanes-Oxley. We make sure that there is sufficient reporting under our whistleblower requirements. Our whistle lines, hotlines, etc., are active and tested, etc. And we also have sort of a global ethics and compliance committee that reviews each and every investigation and the report of each investigation. The way we sort of manage it is that investigations are conducted locally. For every single sort of forensic audit, there is consents, and we make sure that there is also we comply with the policy and the law, and then it is reviewed by a local committee which consists of senior most management. So it consists of myself as the general counsel, the head of HR, the head of finance, the head of supply chain, the head of sales, as well as the CEO. We look and review to ensure that there is a process that was followed, and that there is an outcome and there is a recommendation. We endorse or reject that recommendation depending on precedent, and then basis that, all of that goes to a global ethics and compliance committee, and all of those cases. All of the committee meets once a month, and they review all of these cases. So once we have a fairly standardized global process that's followed across all geographies, we're very, very clear that local law and compliance with local law is paramount. Specifically when it comes to technology or use of technology, we've had instances where people have purposefully chosen not to present themselves for investigations or hearings in order to delay the process. And that continues to remain a challenge for us. And I think there is a medium that we need to find that ensures that we remain compliant with law, but at the same time meets the high standards of the policy and the code that we all live by. And that's really the way we look at it.
I think surprisingly we've run out of time. It didn't feel like it's been an hour, to be honest. It was a lot of fun talking to all of you. So I think maybe I'll just wrap up and then thanks first of all to all of you for being part of this panel. I think one question which whoever is watching this will probably need to figure out is, are we ready for the new regime? So where are we today in terms of compliance with all of the principles that each of you spoke about, and are we ready for what's next? So I think some of the takeaways, or what we need, each organization as an employer needs to think about is what data am I collecting? How am I classifying it, for instance? And if something is what Vaibhav said, will qualify as sensitive personal data, how am I dealing with that? Do I have sufficient policies and additional safeguards in terms of, adding in to ensure that the law is compliant in terms of storing, transferring, and all of that? Vendor contracts is also something which I think we may need to relook either now and see if that's compliant, where personal data, especially of individuals, potential employees, interviewees, how that flows, whether the intermediaries that we spoke of at the beginning have sufficient frameworks, whether there's any audit that's kind of being done. And internally, I think what's also extremely important is what are the kind of SPOCs or the officers that we have internally specifically to deal with concerns of this nature, and how communication kind of distills to them, because there's this it's an interplay between several persons within an organization. You'll have the tech team, you'll have the engineers, you'll have the legal people involved, compliance specialists. So I think there needs to be that internal differentiation of duties, how the role each person plays, and who's the SPOC, who's going to be, say, data privacy officers, what their qualifications will be, and things like that. I think this is an area that is going to be very interesting going forward. After the, just on a related note, like how the IBC brought in a lot of insolvency and bankruptcy professionals. I think this is a niche area now, and we all need to kind of understand what are the skill sets they bring and kind of see how they fit in within the larger organization. So yes, I think this has been great. I just thought I'd put out some takeaways for whoever's watching this to know, what's next, and we just don't talk about the various complexities involved. So thanks once again. Thank you so much, and I hope we do something like this in the future.
Thank you, Sowmya. Thank you, Vaibhav.
Thanks.
Preeti,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.